Thanks, that was terrific. I guess you can sit back there, but maybe the harmless torture stuff. Yeah, that's another one. Yeah, I have. We've actually talked about some of this a bit. Yeah, you should perhaps be up here. I mean, you may get some questions too. I'll say just a few very brief things. First of all, I agree with you that liability is not a sufficient justification. I hope I've never written that it is, though I think probably I have. I tend to be guilty of all kinds of mistakes. I probably have said something like that, but it seems to me, on reflection, pretty obvious that liability can't be a sufficient justification in every case. It may well be that somebody says to me, if you kill this person, murderer's getting ready to commit a murder. I can shoot him, save the murder victim. He's liable to be killed in defense of the person he's about to murder, but he's also somebody who's the only person in the world who can disarm this bomb that's going to blow up New York City or something. Then I shouldn't kill him even though he's liable to be killed. The question in this case, though, is, what the other factors are that are relevant, that can override a liability justification, that apply in the case of the minimally responsible threateners, but not at all, or at least differently in the case of the fully culpable threateners. And that, so the puzzle still, I think, survives even if we concede, as I think we should, that liability isn't a sufficient justification. There's a minor point here when you say even if someone is liable to be killed, it doesn't follow that killing that person would be, you wouldn't be wronging that person. Maybe what I said about the case involving BJ suggests that you're right about that, but still, what I've been inclined to say in the past is that this necessity constraint is actually internal to liability, so that if killing somebody won't actually do any good, then my conclusion is they're not actually liable to be killed, because the liability depends on things other than just how much harm they would otherwise cause, or how much harm they will cause, and the degree of their responsibility and so on. I think there are both necessity and proportionality conditions kind of built into the concept of liability. But that's only the concept of liability as I use it. I don't claim that that's the way everybody uses it. So what you're saying there might well be right on the way that other people understand that notion. Just a quick comment. The latter part of Dick's papers suggested a solution to the problem, according to which the permissibility of killing depends on how much wrongful harm would be averted by the killing and relative degrees of culpability of the different people involved and that sort of thing. But it doesn't depend on how much harm the person we may decide it's permissible to kill would otherwise have caused. And I think there's usually a correlation there, because when it's permissible to kill somebody as a means of saving other people's lives, that's usually because the killing is going to function defensively. And so what it's going to do is to prevent the harm that this person would otherwise have caused. But of course, it doesn't work that way in all cases. So I take it that one way of articulating what Dick was saying is really that we shouldn't have any kind of boundary between self-defense and self-preservation, or other defense and other preservation, and that this involves dropping the kind of causation requirement on what would otherwise be a liability justification for permissible killing. So Dick is suggesting we just look at relative culpability and how much harm we're going to be able to avert by distributing harm to people who are culpable, according to their degree of culpability or something like that. Just a few problems. When you introduced this idea about culpability, you said moral culpability might be morally culpable or blameworthy with respect to this situation, which seems to suggest some vague kind of causal requirement there. I'm not sure exactly what kind of criterion you have in mind there. Maybe you want to just drop out the with respect to this situation. I don't know. I mean, okay, you don't. But then you got to, if it's not a kind of requirement that the person have caused the threat that's the problem, but they've got to be somehow culpable with respect to the situation, that's got to be fine-tuned and specified a bit more. I'm sympathetic to this whole approach, as I've said to Dick before, and he knows about some cases that I've got in an earlier paper that suggest that the causation requirement is problematic, and Victor's taken it even farther than I have in his world-famous Double Hitman 2 case, which everybody should familiarize themselves with. But another question I have about your suggestion is that when you refer to the harm that's to be prevented, you refer to it as wrongful harm. And that's a notion that I need clarified if I'm going to make more sense of the proposal, because the way that I would understand wrongful harm would be harm to somebody who's not liable to that harm and doesn't deserve that harm. But then the notion of liability is coming in the presuppositions. You don't think so? Okay. All right, that's enough, I think, by way of response. It's not really much of a response. And here go the hands. Okay, let me just take, keep them up for a second, please. I think I've got everybody. Okay, I don't like this idea of giving priority to people I don't know. I'm going to call people in order in which I like them. No, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to do this I'm going to do this completely randomly because I actually know everybody who raised their hand. All right, so eeny, miny, mo. Saba comes up top.
Thanks. So, I mean, regarding a bunch of minimally contributing culpable aggressors, I mean, as you know, I think they can all be killed because they have intentionally overlapping intentions. Their intentions overlap and they do it intentionally. They're working together in furtherance of a common aim. But that's not what my point is on. So, regarding the minimally responsible threat, the conscientious driver, for instance. So, we have one guy who's more responsible for the predicament than the other. And then I guess on your older view, you say that the conscientious driver is liable to be killed. And as you mentioned, some people find this unintuitive. I guess David Roden finds it unintuitive. I talked about it with Dick once. He said it was interesting. And so there's a suggestion. I mean, part of the reason that I find it problematic is that it seems strange that a small difference in responsibility can ground someone's liability to be killed. So I still think that the conscientious driver can be permissibly killed. It's just that they're not liable to be killed. And like you, what I think grounds the permission to kill the conscientious driver is A, the degree of liability they bear for the predicament, and B, a lesser evil justification. But then, as you point out, this lesser evil justification seems like an awfully weak hook upon which to hang a permission to kill someone. So then you have the point about over-punishing, that if we have to impose this unavoidable harm on someone, might as well do it on the person who's liable rather than the person who's not liable. But I think that there might be a better basis by which to impose this extra harm on the on the liable person than this analogy with over-punishing, and that is the minimally responsible threat has a certain absolute degree of responsibility which serves as a basis for liability, an absolute degree of responsibility. but the comparative difference in the responsibility that the minimally responsible threat bears in relation to her victim can serve, I think, as a basis for discounting the disvalue of the unavoidable harm inflicted upon her over and above the degree to which she is liable. So put differently, she bears some responsibility for bringing about the predicament, and this grounds a certain degree of liability to a harm, because those harms are relevantly hers. But she is more responsible than her victim. The fact that she's more responsible than her victim grounds discounting the disvalue of the non-liable harm she bears, because it's fairer than the alternative. So I'm still using your notion of fairness. You said, hey, look, it's more fair to impose unavoidable harm on the person who's more liable, but I'm saying that fairness doesn't ground liability. Rather, it instead grounds a basis for discounting the disvalue of the harm that she bears over and above the degree to which she's liable, which can strengthen the hook, the lesser evil hook, upon which to hang a permission to kill her. I'm not sure, was that?
Okay, yeah.
So it relies on the distinction between absolute and comparative basis of liability.
Right.
Absolute and comparative difference in the degree of responsibility they bear.
Okay. Well, two quick comments. This is a case, the case of the conscientious driver, a case in which I want to accept Dick's claim that liability is not a sufficient justification. So liability is a justification, other things being equal. That is, it's a really, really important factor in this case that this person has made that choice. But if the conscientious driver is a otherwise, saintly 20-year-old and the bystander is a 95-year-old curmudgeon, then I think it would be wrong for the curmudgeon to kill the saint. But that would be a case in which it just seems to me that the liability consideration is overridden. Now, what you're suggesting, as I understand it, is that the difference in degree of responsibility is relevant to weighting the harms that they would suffer beyond any to which they're liable. Is that right? Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay.
Instead affects how we discount the extra harm that we place to which they're not liable.
Okay. Well, the worry I have about that is it looks like the conscientious driver's responsibility for the situation is being counted twice by you in a way that it's counted once by me. That is, it's being counted in the liability, and then it's being counted again in the weight that we give to harms beyond liability.
I don't think it's double counted because it's the comparative difference in the liability that grounds the discounting, not the absolute basis of, not the absolute degree of liability. So I'm trying to get around the double counting problem that way.
Okay.
But maybe we can talk about this.
Okay. Yeah. There are a lot of questions.
On these cases
Yeah.
of the conscientious driver who's responsible in the McMahan sense and skids, just imagine during the culpability of the cases, we can imagine the driver as being not just not culpable, but absolutely praiseworthy or a hero, like driving an ambulance.
Yeah, I've got an ambulance driver case, and I think that makes a difference.
And remember, we only get an accident. I mean, the guy can skid a foot away from me. There's no problem. It's only that my pedestrian, I'm there at this spot, and I might be culpable for being. But you can imagine cases where the pedestrian is culpable. I went out on New Year's Eve. There are lots of drivers on the road. They're not culpably drunk and so on. And sorry, that's not helpful. And I'm just out to get a pack of cigarettes. I couldn't wait an hour later. So I just mean you could revert the case. And I think I can get a case where an uninvolved bystander is still culpable with respect to this situation.
Yeah.
I think you vary the culpability.
Yeah, I don't think it's just it's not just it's varying more than culpability.
Responsibility can just drop out.
Okay. Yeah, no. I think I agree with all that you're saying. I do think it makes a difference if the driver has a moral justification for driving rather than just driving out of self-interest, though quite permissibly driving out of self-interest. I also think it makes a difference if the bystander has voluntarily assumed some risk. So I do think those considerations are relevant. Okay, I'm doing the impartial randomizing thing. Oh, the Saba again. Yeah, it really did happen. Okay, this time it looks like it's Matthias.
Yeah, after both contributions, I wonder whether you could explain how exactly the idea of culpability, which also plays a role in your thought, hangs together with the fairness. Is it just that if I culpably do something, it's even more unfair if the harm would be shifted to the victim? But then you need an account of what exactly it is in culpability, that what's the connection to fairness? Now, I just wondered about the final example where you, would it make that the minimally responsible attackers, and you displayed that they're making a mistake. So in a way, this harm is really unavoidable because they don't know that they do something wrong, and I'm as the victim, I mean, just imagine that I can't change the situation. Whereas with really culpable aggressors, we think they can actually avoid it because they know that they're doing something wrong here. Often enough, I think that when we talk about wrongful harm, the real wrong of intentionally attacking somebody just gets deleted. So I wondered what you think about first the relationship between culpability and fairness, and then whether that would explain this final scenario.
It seems to me that you're raising here a question about the relevance of choice. You're saying that the culpable people, because they know that they're doing something wrong, they can choose not to do the wrong, but the minimally responsible threateners, they believe that they're doing what's right, and so they don't realistically have the same kind of choice that the culpable people do. Is that kind of what you're saying, and why is that? How's that relevant? Well, again, the person in the room who's written most about this is Victor. I think that this is, and he has some debts to Scanlon on this as well. And I do think this question about having the choice of avoidance is important here. But see, I think that one of the basis for the liability of the conscientious driver is that she does actually make a voluntary choice to expose innocent people to risk in order to drive her car to the cinema, which is the example that I used when I set up the case. So that's a choice. It involves a choice to expose people to risk for the sake of one's own interest. And this is why I think that if the person has a moral justification for driving, then it's a quite different case. So it is something like the extent to which the choice is kind of a morally optional choice that makes the big difference here. Now, the minimally responsible threateners in the they too make a choice. They're choosing to go out and try to kill somebody. Now, they're acting conscientiously and so on, but they've gotten it wrong. I'm not the one who's gotten it wrong. They've got it wrong. Maybe they've got it wrong through bad luck, but it's still option bad luck rather than brute bad luck. And that's, I guess, what I think makes the difference there. David, I really am doing this randomizing here. Yeah, I'm sorry, it's that David, yes. Are there two? No. No, it's...
Thanks, yeah. So I just wanted, so you discussed a little bit my way of dealing with these issues, which you characterized as having to do with a kind of obligation of humanity somehow. So I just wanted to say a couple of words just to clarify how I think some of these issues can be dealt with. So when I think about the question of the justification of defensive harm, I think we're really asking two questions, right? We're asking how it can be permissible to engage in harmful action given the fact that people have rights. And in that sense, we're asking questions about liability and forfeiture and so forth. And the second question, and then the second thing we're asking is how it can be permissible to engage in defensive harming given the fact that there is an obligation to realize impersonal goods in the world, right? And that's the question we ask about lesser evil and proportionality and so forth. And in order for a defensive act to be permissible, all things considered, both of those elements have to be aligned in the right way, right? And the question we really need to answer is why the first set of those considerations is non-aggregative and the second is. And I think the first set of considerations is non-aggregative because I think that the question about rights and liability is essentially an interpersonal question. It's about the relationship between right and duty holder. And I have a particular account of the way that that kind of emerges out of relationships between right and duty holders. The second component, the kind of impersonal value one, I think is just obviously aggregative because it's about the realization of kind of impersonal goods in the world. So it's aggregative in that very obvious way. Now, to make these kinds of cases fall out in the right way, kind of given all of that context, I think you need to assume a couple of things, which I think are both plausible and true. So that you need to assume that when you inflict a harm on a person who's liable to that harm, so they tick the first of those boxes, the rights liability box, that you are inflicting an impersonal harm, which is less than the harm that you inflict on a person who is non-liable, but nonetheless not zero, right? So to harm somebody who's liable to a harm is not to violate their rights, so it ticks that box. But at the same time, it still does something which is an impersonal bad in the world. But it is not as bad as a harm inflicted on somebody who's not liable. Now, if you assume those two things, which, as I said, I think are both plausible and true, then I think that these cases, at least the ones that you're worried about, will fall out in roughly the way that we want them to fall out. And it also seems to me that kind of rough way of viewing it is more or less in alignment with the way that you think about a lot of these things as well. So I hope that's...
I think I see what you're saying. I'm not sure about the appropriateness of describing these things as impersonal harms or something like that, just making the world worse. But put that aside for the moment. I suppose this thing that I still don't understand, that I think I gestured at in my remarks earlier, is how this way of understanding the situation differentiates between the 1,000 minimally responsible threateners and the 1,000 fully culpable threateners. The aggregate harms in the world are the same in both cases. And so it looks like they should stand or fall together.
The harm of inflicting death on a person who's liable to it is not a non-zero harm. It is a harm, but it's a considerably less harm than inflicting it on a person.
Yeah, see, I don't. If we're talking about impersonal harms here, I just don't understand what the justification for the discounting is. That's the problem. So the culpability seems to me to have been taken into account already when we've ticked the one box, the liability box, the relation between the parties and so on. And then when you get to the impersonal badness of the harm in the world, I don't see why that comes back in again. It seems to me that should drop out at that point.
I don't understand why we should cabin aggregation and not having spirit duty holders in life. And as Thompson said, she backs away. She rightly said, look, whether it's okay to infringe a right depends on how bad it would be for right holders if the right is not respected, how bad it would be for non-right holders if the right is not, if you don't have against the right. And so I don't see what there's this morality of duty and obligations cabined away from aggregation. I mean, it's built into the idea.
Well, if we were talking about infringement of a right that's substantive, it's still different. We were talking about forfeiture, genuine liability. I think it's the latter case that I'm concerned about. When you want to say that the right is no longer there in the appropriate sense.
As chairman here, I'm going to have to intervene. Apparently, we've got one more minute. Sorry about this. All right, here we go. Last one. Helen.
Just a quick follow-up on what Sal said first. I'm not sure that you can avoid the double counting objection by saying that the justification isn't grounded in the absolute liability, but is rather grounded in the comparative liability, because surely the comparative liability is grounded in the absolute liability. I mean, that's just what you compare. I mean, it seems like that's what you compare, right? That's got to be the basis of any comparison, is the absolute liability. So, but the difference arises from the absolute. Anyway, but yeah, I'm just wondering why, in the case with Bradley's leg, why is it that you want to say that he's liable to the harm, and then this raises this problem of, it looks like, turns out we have to compensate people for harms even if they were liable to them? Why don't you just say he was liable to 90%, but just given the way that the world is, we have to give him 100%. So it should have been that you lost, you know, your toes and he lost his leg to the knee up, but it turns out he has to lose all his leg. And the reason why you compensate him is because he got 10% more than he should have had, so you compensate the 10%. And that way you avoid this problem that you have to start saying that people can be due compensation for harms even if they were liable to them, because you just say you're only compensating the extra. I don't understand why you don't want to say that.
Well, you know, that might work. I'd have to think about it. It's certainly the way we would think about desert, but I have always thought that liability works rather differently from desert. That is, desert has to be really precisely calibrated to exactly what somebody would otherwise have done and the degree of responsibility and so on. But liability is giving us conclusions about the distribution of unavoidable harms, where, you know, you can make sense of this fine-grained talk when we've got avoidable harms. So whenever I'm punishing someone retributively in accordance with their desert, I can usually choose to give them right up to their desert and no more. I can calibrate it fairly precisely. But liability, the notion of liability is a cruder form of moral justification.
But do you want to say that it gives us conclusions? Because didn't you just a minute ago say that it doesn't, right?
Well, it means that all things considered, you know, I made it BJ's leg because I wanted it to be a compensable harm. Mm. But you could make it a killing case where the harm I do can't be compensated for. That's not because I think that killing can never be compensated for. I think it can. But let's just suppose in this case, there's no way I can compensate BJ in the slightest. I still want to claim I have a liability justification for ensuring that he's the one who gets killed rather than me.
But it wouldn't necessarily have to make the difference between the permissibility of inflicting the harm or not. It could just make a difference to whether or not you can compensate, and then whether you've done something that's bad. But it doesn't. That wouldn't necessarily have to mean that you couldn't inflict the harm upon him. Okay.
I think this is a case where we agree on the substance but are worrying about how to apply the language, maybe. Do we have one more or stop?
One more question.
And Dick gets it. No.
Okay, one more.
Looks like it's Kai. And Kai is gone. Looks like Seth. Sorry, this was really genuinely randomized.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the implications of this form of combined justification are likely to overspill. So one of the things you've said in response to the worry that your account of liability to be killed in war might render lots of non-combatants liable to be killed, is that there are so many of them that the harms that they do are so small, and killing any one of them would only avert a very tiny amount of harm. So that's something you said in your paper and analysis. But this sort of combined justification story is going to apply to non-combatants as well as it does to soldiers. So I wonder how you would then, at that point, restrain the same sort of worries arising in this case, where basically your account is going to either show that many non-combatants are liable to be killed, or that there's a combined justification for killing them. So how are you going to preserve the principle of distinction in light of this form of combined justification?
Mainly by claiming that, in general, people who are fighting in an unjust war and out carrying guns around and so on are actually the probability that they're going to inflict serious harms on individuals is much higher than the probability that the action of most non-combatants is going to inflict a serious harm on somebody. So in general, I tend to think that for most non-combatants, the degree of harm that to the victims of the unjust war that can be attributable causally to their action or to their contribution is going to be very, very small. So that means that the degree of harm to which they're going to be liable is very low. So the lesser evil justification is going to have to cover almost all of the harm that one inflicts on them if one kills them. Now, I agree with you. That actually may well be true of a number of combatants as well. And when that's true and a combatant of that sort is killed, then a real serious injustice has been done. But there's this difference, and that is that in the case of the unjust combatants, they bear some responsibility for making it reasonable for you to believe that the probability that they're going to cause serious harm is higher than that, and considerably higher than that in the case of non-combatants. So, I mean, I do concede that I think there are going to be a lot of cases in which the unjust combatants are going to be liable to be killed, and that's true fact relative and so on. There are going to be other cases, I think fewer in number, in which the unjust combatants are going to be relevantly like civilians whose their contribution is really tiny and they're not liable to be killed, and there may not even be a combined justification for killing them. If they get killed, I mean, that is something that the potential for that injustice is a reason for thinking that the war may actually be disproportionate. And, you know, that's something I'm happy to accept. On the other hand, in those cases in which such a combatant is killed and the injustice is done is rather great, I still don't think that that individual has been wronged in quite the same way that a civilian would have been, precisely because that person has made it reasonable for the just combatants to believe that he's among the combatants who are actually liable to be killed. That's an incomplete answer, but thanks.
Let's come back at 5 minutes after the hour, so a little bit of extra time for a break.